Hello human body system students, and welcome to our lesson on the eye. Let's begin with a description of visual processing. So this is basically just how sensory information that comes from the eyes is processed in the brain. So at the back of each eyeball there is one optic nerve just coming straight out of the back. It is attached to the sensory tissue actually inside of the eyeball, which we'll get to later. And then the optic nerve travels behind the eyeball to the point called the optic chiasm, which you learned about in the 2.3.2 section when that individual had a pituitary tumor that was pushing on the optic chiasm and causing visual disturbance. So about half of the fibers from an optic nerve will cross over to the other side of the brain. So like for example, here is a left eyeball transferring across to the right side of the brain, this gray nerve tissue right here. About half of them cross at the optic chiasm and the other half carry on back to the same side of the brain as the eyeball is on. Same thing over here with the other eyeball. So they cross halfway at the optic chiasm, and then that nerve tissue travels all the way back through the brain to the occipital visual cortex, which you know is where most of the visual processing of the brain occurs. Now let's move into some of the anatomy of the actual eyeball. So the order that light passes through the structures of the eye is going to be followed in this presentation. So first, we have the cornea of the eye. So this is kind of a covering right in front of the eye, in front of your iris and in front of your pupil. It does a little bit of focusing of light because it has this kind of rounded shape. It focuses light a little bit, and that's why if you have something like a misshapen cornea, you can have trouble seeing. But the cornea is in the front of the eye. It's tough. It protects these delicate inner tissues from things getting through into the eye. Just behind the cornea, we have what's called the aqueous humor. And so this is a very liquid, watery substance that's right behind the cornea. So if this white bit here is the cornea, just behind the cornea, but in front of the iris and the lens and all of that, is the aqueous humor, and this is some liquid that helps keep the cornea kind of puffed out and rounded in the shape that it should be, because you can see that the whole eyeball has the same kind of shape until it gets to the front portion where the cornea is, and then it kind of poofs out a little bit more, and that just has to do with refracting light so that it can end up on the retina the right way. But the aqueous humor helps to keep that cornea poofed out the way it should be. In the absence of aqueous humor, the cornea will deflate and kind of wrinkle up, and it makes vision pretty much impossible. Behind the aqueous humor, we have the pupil and the iris. So it's really the iris has a pupil in it. So the iris is a muscular ring. It's the colored part of your eye, which you think of when you think about the colored part of your eye. It's made out of involuntary muscle that expands and contracts the size of the pupil. And this muscle tissue has a lot of collagen fibers in it. That's like you can see in here, all this kind of banding that's down to some collagen. So the color of the eye depends on how much melanin is in the eye. So if you have a brown eye, it means you have a lot of melanin present, a lot of that pigment in the muscle of the iris. If you have a green eye, you have some melanin present, but not as much as a brown eye. And if you have a blue eye, you don't have any melanin present in your iris tissue at all. And so the pupil in the center of the iris is just like the aperture of a camera. So it'll expand and contract based on how much light your eye needs to let through. So when it's dark, the pupil expands in size to allow more light to come in so that you can see in the dark. And when it's bright out, your pupil will contract smaller so that there's not too much light entering the eye and potentially damaging the delicate sensory tissue at the back of the eye. Next is the lens of the eye, and so if we look in this diagram here, here's the cornea, here's the aqueous humor, here is the ring of the iris, here's the pupil where light passes through, and just behind the pupil, suspended by these little connective tissue fibers, is the lens of the eye. So the lens of the eye, through the action of these, they're called ciliary muscles, will kind of distort its shape a little bit to focus. And so you can feel this happening, like if you put your hand up close to your face and focus on the palm of your hand and then remove that hand from in front of your eye and focus on something far away, you can feel the change that occurs in the eyeball as those muscles are involuntarily adjusting the shape of the lens so that you can focus on near and far objects. Behind the lens of the eye is what's called the vitreous humor, and this is a very jelly-like gooey substance. You can see it just here. So if this is the front half of the eyeball, this is the back half of the eyeball. Here's the lens, just the pupil is just in front of this lens, and then suspending the lens and like all throughout the rest of this space of the eyeball is this jelly-like stuff called the vitreous humor. So the function of this is to keep the eyeball round and keep pressure so that your eyeball stays in the correct shape, and it helps kind of keep this little filmy retina tissue pushed up against the back of the eye where it should be. There's a procedure called a vitrectomy in which this vitreous humor can be removed. If there's too much pressure in the eye, it can damage the delicate retina or even the optic nerve coming out of the back of the eye, and so they'll remove some of that humor. Potentially they have to remove so much that the eyeball kind of deflates a little bit, but over time it will refill back up with more vitreous humor. And now the retina, the most important part of the eye for vision. If you don't have a retina, you can't see. Even if everything else is perfect, if you don't have a retina, you can't see anything. Because this is the actual nervous tissue that contains the sensory neurons that detect light. So it's just kind of like in this little cartoon diagram, it's just like this thin film that's covering the whole back of the eye and a little bit towards the front. It kind of thins out as it gets towards the front. But this film of tissue is all connected to the back of the eye at one spot, which is called the optic disc. This optic disc doesn't have photoreceptors in it, but the rest of the retina does have these specialized sensory cells called photoreceptors. There's two main kinds of these in humans. We have rods and we have cones, and this is based on kind of what the cell is shaped like. The rod cells are shaped kind of rectangularly, and the cones shaped a little bit more triangularly. So rods are photoreceptors that can detect just whether something is light or something is dark, and cones in the eye can actually like distinguish between the different colors of the visual light spectrum. So the types of cones that we have present in the human eye are red, green, and blue, and so every color that you see with your eyes is some combination of the cones in your eyes interpreting red and green and blue and like adjusting that to tell your brain what the color is that you're seeing. So when there is a condition like color blindness, that has to do with some kind of difference in these cones that are found in the retina. So then we have the optic nerve. This is that retina. It all kind of comes together at that one spot and then travels out the back of the eye through the optic nerve. So it's just a bundle of all those neurons leaving the eye, going from the retina and traveling all the way back through the brain to the occipital lobe for visual processing. So some other stuff about the eye. The sclera of the eye is like basically the whole rest of the eyeball. It's all the white part of your eye. It's thick and it's structural tissue, so it supports the shape of the eye, and then that is then helped by the vitreous humor inside of the eye, helping it keep its round shape. So again, these ciliary muscles, they're the little muscles that are attached to the lens that help it change its shape so that you can focus on things. So again, the optic disc is that spot where the whole retina attaches to the back of the eyeball, and that's called your blind spot because again, there's no photoreceptors there, so you can't actually detect sensory stimuli in the blind spot of your retina. Then there is the macula, which is a point on the retina where your vision is most focused, and so the light focuses on the macula the best, and so this is where the majority of like the sensory reception is taking place. And then there's a little structure called a fovea centralis, and it's just a teeny little spot. You can kind of see like if this is the outline of the macula here, this little darker spot right in the center here is called your fovea centralis. If you look closely, you can see a little point right in the middle there. And this is just the spot where your visual acuity or your like sharpness of vision is the absolute best because light is basically perfectly focused right there on the fovea centralis. So this structure called a tapetum is not found in humans. This is more found in animal eyes, but we got to talk about it because it's really cool. So it's this shiny layer. So here's some retina that's like peeled away from the back of the eye. And then behind the retina in some animals is this shiny layer of iridescent tissue called the tapetum. And so the function of this is that when light passes through the eye, it hits the retina and then it carries on going to the back of the eyeball through the retina. And then if there's this reflective layer here, it bounces that light back into the retina one more time. And so you're getting like extra exposure of that light. And so it helps you to see better at night, because in low light conditions, if you can reflect that light again onto the retina, it just helps your rods detect a little bit more light. And so this gives you good night vision. And this is like, if you've ever seen, I don't know, like some kind of little deer or something walking around in your yard at night, and they look over at you and their eyes reflect back green at you, you're seeing the reflection of light off of this tapetum in the back of their eye. We also have the choroid, which is a layer of vascular tissue that's between the retina and the sclera, so this helps to provide blood supply to the eyeball. Let's move on to some problems that can be associated with the eye. So first we have cataracts. Cataracts are pretty common. This happens when you have UV damage that happens to your eyeball, and it causes some proteins to kind of clump together on the front of the lens, and it makes the lens turn cloudy. So this is like if you've ever had an old dog that you knew, and you look at them and their eyes are kind of this grayish cloudy color. It's because, you know, you don't put sunglasses on your dog, and so they get UV damage on their eye over time, and their lens gets cloudy. This happens in humans too. And there is a procedure that can be done where they go in and actually scrape those protein clumps off of the lens to help fix vision, but that doesn't always work, and it's not always permanent. Next we have retinal detachment, which is a very, very, very bad problem to have for your vision. This is when that thin, delicate layer of retina peels away from the back of the eye. So you can kind of see that happening right here. So again, here's your blind spot, here's your macula, here's just some other retinal tissue. It's kind of been peeled away from the back surface of the eye. This is pretty much caused by head trauma. So like I knew an individual who was playing basketball and he got hit in the side of the head with the basketball and part of his retina detached from that blunt trauma. So this can cause really bad floaters or flashes in your vision because it's like the sensory tissue it can't detect what's actually the stimulus around, and so it's like firing back to the brain that it sees something that's not actually there, or possibly even blindness, because if retinal detachment is really bad, you no longer have those photoreceptors attached to the back of your eye, and so you can't detect the stimulus of the light. And so if you can't detect the stimulus of the light, your eye cannot tell the brain what it sees. Next we have glaucoma, again a very common disorder of the eye. This occurs when there's damage to the optic nerve because of excess pressure in the eye. So this is a problem associated with chronic high blood pressure, which is common in patients with diabetes because, as we know, high blood sugar causes high blood pressure. So if you've got chronic high blood sugar from diabetes, you're going to develop chronic high blood pressure. And the eye is delicate, and so if the pressure in the eye exceeds kind of a narrow window, it will press too hard on the back of the eye and it can damage the optic nerve, and it leads to pretty severe visual disturbance. Okay, so now on to just like the more regular like visual problems that a lot of people experience. So the lens is supposed to focus light very specifically into an exact point on the back of the eye, that macula point. And if your lens is kind of misshapen or your ciliary muscles can't like get the lens to change their shape correctly, you can be nearsighted, farsighted, whatever like that. So nearsightedness is called myopia. So this is when, if you look in this upper diagram here, the lens is shaped in such a way that as these black lines are representing light. So as the light comes through the lens, it bends the light. That's the whole function of the lens, is to bend the light so that it can focus on the retina. But the lens is shaped in such a way that where the light rays actually focus together perfectly is in front of where the retina is. And so it's not focusing on the actual retina. So the way that you can correct myopia or a myopic lens is with a concave shaped lens, either in your glasses or in your contacts. So you put another lens, glasses or contacts, in front of the lens of your eyeball, and it has this concave shape. And so when the light passes through that concave lens, it kind of scatters it a little bit further, so that by the time it passes through the misshapen lens in the eyeball, that light, the focal point, is now moved backwards to land perfectly on the retina, and you are able to see with the use of this lens in front of your eye if you have nearsightedness or myopia. Kind of the exact opposite of myopia is hyperopia, and this is farsightedness. So now up here, you've got a lens shaped in such a way that as the light passes through, the exact point that the light focuses would be behind where the actual retina is. And so you correct this with the opposite shaped lens, a convex lens, because the convex lens, as the light passes through the convex lens in front of the eye, either again part of your glasses or your contacts or whatever, it will cause that light to scatter inward, and so it kind of moves that focal point forward so that it's landing directly on your retina so that you can have clear vision when you have this extra lens in front of your eye. Astigmatism is also really common. So this is when you don't have just one focal point, your light is focusing on your retina in multiple places, not exactly just on that one spot, the macula, where it's supposed to be focusing. It's focused in a couple different places because your cornea is elongated or misshapen. So while the lens does the main job of focusing, some of the light focusing does happen as it passes through that clear cornea in front of the eye. So if your cornea is wonky shaped, you can get a little bit of indirect scattering of light so that it's landing on different places in the back of the eye. So astigmatism, depending on the way that the cornea is misshapen, it can either cause you to be more myopic or hyperopic than you would be with just whatever shape your lens is in your eye. So this one I felt like is really important to talk to you guys about because of the use of technology in today's society. So this macular degeneration is the leading cause of blindness in like the industrial world. So this is when you have deterioration of that macula. So that spot on your eye where the light is focusing perfectly can get damaged by excess light exposure. And so they found in recent years that the light that comes out of like phones and computers and stuff is a big factor that causes too much stress on that macula and cause it to degenerate. And so this is kind of what it looks like if you saw this animation as it was playing. It just kind of gives you this dark blind spot in your field of view because that macula where the light is focusing is being destroyed by, whatever. I mean, it's not just phones. It could be excess UV light, could be anything like that. So that's why it's always important to make sure that when you go outside in bright conditions, you have sunglasses on, especially if you have light colored eyes like blue because you don't have the melanin to absorb that UV light from your iris. And it's also important to, if you're using any type of electronic device, especially your phone, that you have another light on in the room, because if you're like laying in your bed in the dark looking at your phone, then all of that blue light coming from your phone screen is focusing right onto your macula with nothing kind of diluting it, I guess. And so it can cause really bad strain on your macula and potentially lead to macular degeneration when you are older. Here we go, finally at the end. The final eye problem that we're going to talk about is called strabismus, and any kind of strabismus has to do with being cross-eyed. So this has to do with like the muscles that surround the eye that allow them to move. There's some kind of problem with those. So there's four main types. Esotropia is when you have one eye that's pointing inward. So here's an example of esotropia. Exotropia is when you have one eye that's pointing slightly outward. So here's exotropia in this diagram. Hypertropia, you have an eye that points upward a little bit compared to the one that's correct. And hypotropia, you have one eye that's pointing downwards. So normal vision, you should have both eyes looking straight forward. And in any type of strabismus, you're cross-eyed. So in all of these pictures, these are just one eyeball, but strabismus can be just one or both eyes. It can be one side or it can be bilateral.